Well, let's move on to Finland. And yesterday was election day, and I know that the Finnish people support Ukraine in our fight for freedom, said Anton Gerashchenko yesterday. Thank you, and grateful to the government of Marin Sanna Marin, that is, standing with Ukraine. Unfortunately for her, it didn't work because she has lost her position as Prime Minister of Finland and to be replaced with the more conservative. So she apparently trying to take Finland in a very left-wing direction. That hasn't gone down terribly well with the electorate. And although her party, as is typical, I suppose, with proportional representation systems, her party has ended up with more seats, but a smaller majority. And so the more conservative side have won this election. So that's Petteri Orpo has won the election, defeating Sanna Marin. So the question then for us all is, bearing in mind that she was driving forward with the NATO policy, was part of this, a reaction to that. I don't know the answer to that yet. I was speaking to Alex Thompson earlier on, and he certainly feels that it had something to play in the part to play in the decision, but we need to do a bit more to find out how much it did.
Yeah, but it appears that there's been a backlash over the getting closer to NATO, and maybe people in Finland getting frightened of where the country's now headed.
Well, in the meantime, then let's have a look at the latest from Mr. Zelensky himself. Because he's going nuts over the fact that Russia takes the presidency of the Security Council this month in the United Nations. Unfortunately, he said, we have some obviously absurd and destructive news. Russia is chairing the UN Security Council. It's hard to imagine anything that proves more the total bankruptcy of such institutions. Okay, well, that's his position. His colleague, Dmitry Kuleba, said reform is obviously necessary to prevent a terrorist state and any other state that wants to be a terrorist from destroying the peace. Now, of course, the UK is largely driving forward with the agenda to reform the Security Council because it wants to see Russia and China effectively their veto removed. And why? Because Russia and China have prevented quite a lot of warfare by vetoing it over the years. One of the reasons I think that the UN has been sidestepped in some cases. But I wonder what the Russian response was to all this. Let's have a look. Here's Dmitry Polyansky, who's the Russian Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, saying Russia will act as an honest broker during its presidency, unlike the proponents of the rules-based order. International law and procedure rules developed over decades are actually in effect in the UN instead of the rules-based order, which the collective West seeks to replace international law with. Unlike our former Western partners, we play fair on the international arena and we do not promote double standards. Now, I think possibly the most interesting part of this, Brian, is the use of the word former, because every time I've heard the Russians talking about the West in recent years, it's been our Western partners. But to call them our former Western partners...
It's a pretty strong point.
Yes, I think it is. So then let's move on to Viktor Orbán. And he had this to say on Kossúth Radio over the weekend. EU leaders are actively discussing the possibility of sending some kind of peacekeeping force to Ukraine, perhaps under the NATO banner. If this continues, the danger of a world war is not a literary exaggeration. That may be literal, it may be just a bad translation. But anyway, that, I think, if there's any truth in that, is an extremely dangerous development.
Well, we know, we've got to say, we know from the West's duplicity over the years that those peacekeepers, of course, will actually have a secondary role, or some of them will, and that will be to help prosecute the war. So the Russians are going to see this as an exceptionally dangerous move, because it will enable the West to have their experts in on the ground to fight the tanks or provide more detailed intelligence on the battlefield. So this is further engagement by NATO, but under the guise of calling it peacekeepers.
So let's see what the Russians had to say about Orbán's comments. He said, this is Dmitry Peskov, who said, if we're talking about some kind of serious negotiations, then this is a potentially dangerous discussion. in world practice, such forces, as a rule, as peacekeeping forces, are used only with the consent of both parties. In this case, it's potentially a very dangerous topic, and so on. And in the meantime, the Russians have released their concept for foreign policy of the Russian Federation, and Sergei Lavrov introduced this. So this is what he had to say: the existential nature of threats to our country's security and development that are being created by unfriendly states has been recognized. The document designates the United States as the main originator and vehicle of the anti-Russian policy. Overall, the policy of the West that is aimed at the all-out degrading of Russia is described as a new type of hybrid war. I'm going to suggest that the Russians have got this wrong. The United States might be the bully boys here, but I think the main vehicle of anti-Russian policy is the United Kingdom. Yeah. So they may want to look elsewhere. David, have you any thoughts?
Well, we're seeing a mention of the new type of hybrid war, but meanwhile, on the ground, we've got a very, very old type of non-hybrid war. And I think this is one of the differences between the view of the West and the view of the rest of the world. The West is convinced that they can essentially operate soft power. And it's been proven in this case not to be true, right? That ultimately, when vital interests are at stake, and this is a vital interest for Russia, then it's old-fashioned hard power that comes into play. It's not a vital interest for the West. It's not a vital interest for Britain, for America, or for even Germany. And as such, we will not see the willingness or the public support or anything else to enable troops to be placed on the ground. I suspect the idea that a NATO peacekeeping force can be deployed is simply fanciful, because it couldn't be deployed as a peacekeeping force because there would be war. And I don't think that would ever be supported in Western countries, at least at the moment.
Yes, I would just suggest that the idea of hybrid war. Of course, Ukraine is only one front in a bigger war that's been going on for a long time, across multiple domains, mainly, admittedly, in the information space up to now, David, but much broader than just what's happening in Ukraine itself.
That's for sure, but Ukraine's been the one where it's actually pushed into another country's vital interest to such an extent that it had to go as to a hot war. I suppose if you exclude Syria, because obviously the attack on Syria, terrorist-led, looking to subdivide the country, obviously challenged Syrian vital interests, so that also turned into a hot war. So this is the point that the West is going to have to realise, that there are lines, and you have to respect them, because if you don't, unfortunate things start to happen, and then things start to develop their own momentum, and the Western capitals may no longer be in control.